The Vampire of Blackwood Forest, the true story of the Ashford bloodsucker. In the autumn of 1872, loggers working in the dense Blackwood Forest near Ashford, Massachusetts, made a discovery that would teach even hardened men the meaning of fear. What they found in a hidden ravine would forever change the town and reveal one of the darkest truths in American history. 13 bodies, all completely drained of blood, lay arranged in gruesome order. Their bodies were pale as fresh snow, their eyes wide open in silent horror. But the most terrifying thing wasn't their deaths themselves, but the fact that all victims bore 2 precise puncture wounds on their necks, as if something inhuman had drained their lifeblood. What investigators would discover in the following weeks was even more horrifying than any legend of the undead and creatures of the night, because the Vampire of Ashford was no mystical creature from old folklore. It was a respected man who had operated in the heart of the town for over 2 decades, disguised as a benefactor to the poor and sick. Dr. Augustus Steinberg, physician to the town council and celebrated scholar, had systematically murdered over 100 people, and no one had noticed. Before we dive into the gruesome truth behind these murders, I want to ask you something important. This channel explores the darkest chapters of American history, stories that most people would rather forget. If you're still here, you're different from the others. You understand that some truths, no matter how disturbing, must be told. Hit that subscribe button now and become part of our community of fearless truth seekers. And write in the comments, what city are you watching from? Are you brave enough to learn what really happened in your own hometown? Chapter I. Ashford, Massachusetts, Autumn 1872. The Ashford of 1872 was a town in transition and yet a town full of scars. The Civil War, which had ended just 7 years earlier, had left deep wounds in the fabric of the town. The population was decimated. Entire neighborhoods still lay in ruins, and survivors fought daily for survival in a world that had lost its order. And yet, or perhaps because of this, a special kind of hope flourished in these difficult years. The town, nestled between the gentle hills of western Massachusetts and the dark forests of Blackwood, attracted people seeking a fresh start after the war. Farmers from devastated homesteads, craftsmen who had lost their workshops, widows and orphans without family, they all flocked to Ashford, hoping for protection, work, and a new life. The town itself was a labyrinth of narrow streets winding between tall wooden buildings. The mighty Episcopal Church, whose steeple towered visibly over the slate roofs, dominated the skyline. Its shadow fell across town square in the evening hours, where farmers sold their wares daily and beggars pleaded for alms. The Mill Creek, those small waterways that ran through the streets, supplied the town with water and carried, on some nights, as would later become clear, darker secrets away with them. The town gates were closed at nightfall, and the night watchmen began their rounds. Hear ye, good people all. Our clock has struck 10, they called through the dark streets. But their presence offered only apparent security, because in a time when death was omnipresent, through epidemics, hunger, and the aftermath of war, an additional death here and there hardly stood out. The Blackwood Forest, which rose immediately beyond the town gates, was more than just a forest. It was a dark, mysterious world unto itself, filled with ancient trees whose canopies stood so dense that even at noon hardly any sunlight reached the forest floor. People feared the forest and avoided it after sunset. Too many stories circulated about travelers who had never returned, about strange lights between the trees, and about screams in the night that didn't come from known animals. In this atmosphere of hope and fear, between reconstruction and the shadows of the past, Dr. Augustus Steinberg operated, a man of 50 years, tall and distinguished in appearance. His hair, once jet black, already showed first silver streaks at the temples. His features were finely cut, almost aristocratic, with a high forehead crossed by deep thinking lines. The dark eyes beneath bushy brows seemed intelligent and penetrating, eyes that seemed to see through a person. Dr. Steinberg always dressed in the dark, dignified garments of a learned physician, heavy wool coats in black and dark red, with white lace collars that emphasized his social standing. At his side always hung a leather doctor's bag, in which he carried his instruments, scalpels, bloodletting needles, and small vials with mysterious tinctures. What distinguished Dr. Steinberg from other doctors of his time, and what would later enable his diabolical career, was his extraordinary reputation as a benefactor. While most physicians only treated paying patients, Steinberg regularly opened his house on Elm Street to the poor of the town. Tuesdays and Thursdays, it was known, the needy could receive his help free of charge. He treated fevers, dressed wounds, prescribed medicines, and never asked for a penny. A truly Christian man, the citizens called him. An angel of mercy, the poor raved. Even the town council publicly praised Dr. Steinberg for his charity. He was appointed physician to the town council, received a house in the best location, and was invited to all important social events. What no one knew, Dr. Augustus Steinberg was not a doctor in the true sense. His medical knowledge was real, even extraordinary, but it didn't come from studying the healing arts. Steinberg was an alchemist, an occultist, a man who had dedicated his life to the search for the philosopher's stone and the elixir of eternal life. And in the dark cellars of his house on Elm Street, he conducted experiments that would have made any inquisitor pale. The origins of his obsession lay far in the past. Born as the son of an impoverished merchant near Boston, young Augustus had recognized death as his greatest enemy early on. His mother had died in childbirth. His father and siblings fell victim to cholera when he was just 12 years old. Alone and destitute, he had survived through begging and odd jobs until a wandering alchemist took him on as an assistant. This man, a certain Philip Aurelius, who claimed to be a direct student of the famous Paracelsus, opened up a new world to young Augustus. A world of forbidden books, secret formulas, ancient mysteries. Philip taught him not only the basics of medicine and chemistry, but also the dark arts, necromancy, blood magic, the summoning of spirits. The greatest secret, Philip had confided to young Augustus, lies in the blood. Blood is life. Blood is power. Whoever deciphers the secret of blood deciphers the secret of immortality itself. These words had burned deep into Augustus's soul. When Philip disappeared years later, under mysterious circumstances, some said the authorities had taken him, others claimed he had died in a failed experiment. Augustus continued his master's research, but he went even further. Steinberg's studies of forbidden texts had led him to a frightening conviction. The secret of immortality truly lay in human blood, but not in that of a single person. One had to collect the blood of many people, distill it, treat it in certain moon phases, and mix it with rare herbs and minerals. Only then, he believed, could one create the life elixir that would grant eternal youth and immortality. To test this theory, he needed two things. First, a large quantity of human blood. Second, a laboratory where he could work undisturbed. He found both in Ashford, Pun. The years immediately after the war offered ideal conditions for his cruel experiments. The town was full of strangers, full of faces no one knew. People disappeared constantly. Some died of disease. Others left town in search of better opportunities. Who would miss a beggar? Who would search for a prostitute who was suddenly no longer seen on the streets? Steinberg had carefully developed his system. As a respected doctor, he had access to all levels of society, but especially to the poorest and most vulnerable. His free treatment days were the perfect cover. Poor people, often sick or injured, came to him. Some he actually treated and released again. But others, those whom no one would miss, who had no family, who would be sought by no one. These people disappeared into the cellars of his house. The house itself was perfect for his purposes. From the outside, a respectable townhouse with 3 stories, a steep gabled roof, and small windows with bullseye glass. But beneath the ground floor extended a vast cellar vault that had been carved into the rock over centuries. Steinberg had expanded this vault and converted it into a perfect laboratory. The cellars were separated from the rest of the house by heavy oak doors. No one but himself had access. Not even his housekeeper, the faithful Margaret, was allowed to enter the lower rooms. He had explained that dangerous chemicals were stored there, and the fumes could be deadly. In truth, there was a place of horror there that exceeded all imagination. The first room served as a waiting area for his victims. Here they were sedated with wine to which Steinberg had added opium tincture. In the second room, his actual laboratory, stood oak tables to which he tied his victims. On the walls hung the tools of his cruel craft: bloodletting knives, silver tubes for draining blood, glasses and vials of all sizes. The third room was the most terrifying. Here Steinberg stored the collected blood in large glass vessels, which he treated in certain moon phases. Shelves full of dark red liquid lined the walls. In the center of the room stood a complicated distillation apparatus of glass and copper, with which he tried to extract the essence of life from the blood. And in the back corner, where no one would ever look, was the disposal room. Steinberg had found an old well shaft that led deep into the rock. Here he disposed of the bodies of his victims after he had completely drained them of blood. The corpses disappeared into the darkness, and no one would ever find them. Or so he believed. Dr. Steinberg's first victims had been beggars and vagabonds, people who lived in the ruins on the outskirts of town, who had no names, no past, no future. He lured them with promises of food and wine, sedated them in his cellar, and slowly drained them of their blood. Death usually came after hours, sometimes only after days, when he deliberately slowed the process to observe how the life force withdrew from the body with the blood. The first murders had been tentative, almost experimental, but with each victim, Steinberg became bolder, more confident. He refined his technique, optimized the process. He learned to use exactly the right amount of sedative to keep victims calm but conscious. He developed special needles that allowed blood to flow faster and more efficiently. And he began keeping meticulous records of every single murder, every variation of his procedure, every result of his experiments. In his secret diary, which would later be found, he wrote with frightening sobriety: the 14th of March, 1853, subject number 7, male, approximately 40 years. Complete exsanguination in 6 hours. The blood showed interesting crystallization at the third moon phase. Must conduct further tests. From 1852 to 1872, 20 long years, Dr. Augustus Steinberg operated undetected in Ashford. 20 years in which he systematically murdered people, collected their blood, and searched for the elixir of immortality. 20 years in which the town celebrated him as a benefactor, while he secretly committed one of the most monstrous crimes in American history. The number of his victims grew steadily. After the first beggars and vagabonds, he dared to approach other groups: prostitutes whom no one missed, the sick who already seemed close to death, travelers who were only in town for one night, street children whom no one missed. But Steinberg also made mistakes. His obsession made him careless. In his madness to decipher the secret of immortality, he overlooked details that would have been noticed by a sober observer. Chapter 2. The First Signs. Margaret Brennan had been Dr. Steinberg's housekeeper for 15 years. A pious woman of 50, widow of a cobbler who had fallen in the war. She ran the household with an iron hand, ensured order and cleanliness, and never asked about things that were none of her business. The perfect employee for a man with dark secrets. But even Margaret began, after all these years, to notice things that seemed strange to her. At first they were just small things, hardly worth mentioning. But over time, these small things came together to form a picture that deeply disturbed her. There were, for example, the piles of laundry. Dr. Steinberg produced an unusually large amount of dirty laundry, especially linen sheets that were often covered with dark rust-brown stains. When Margaret asked him about it, he explained that these were blood stains from his medical treatments. A plausible explanation, certainly, but the quantity was unusual, even for a busy doctor. Then there were the nocturnal activities. Margaret lived in the attic of the house, directly above the doctor's living quarters. On some nights, she heard noises from the lower floors, footsteps, the creaking of doors, sometimes even strange sounds she couldn't identify. Once, she later swore, she had heard screams that had abruptly stopped. When she asked the doctor about it the next morning, he explained that he often treated patients in emergencies at night, people who had seriously injured themselves and could find no other help. The screams, he said, came from a man from whom he had to pull an infected tooth. Margaret believed him, or wanted to believe him. Dr. Steinberg was a good employer, paid on time, and was always polite. Why should she doubt him? But then something happened that turned her doubts into certainty. It was a frosty November morning in 1871, almost a year before the Great Discovery. Margaret had gotten up earlier than usual to light the stove in the kitchen. As she went down the stairs, she noticed that the cellar door, that heavy oak door that was normally locked, stood slightly ajar. Normally, Margaret would have simply closed the door and gone about her work. But that morning, on an impulse she couldn't explain later, she stepped closer to the door and peered through the narrow gap. What she saw made her blood freeze in her veins. A stone staircase led down into the darkness, and at the foot of this staircase, faintly illuminated by a flickering candle, she saw something that took her breath away. A table. And on this table lay the figure of a person, motionless, with arms and legs spread out. And beside the table stood Dr. Steinberg, his back to her, busy with something Margaret couldn't see. She wanted to scream, wanted to ask what was going on down there, but fear paralyzed her. With trembling hands, she quietly pulled the door closed again and fled upstairs to her chamber, where she collapsed on her bed, her heart pounding in her chest. All day long she could think of nothing else. Had she really seen a person lying on the table? Or had her imagination played a trick on her? She tried to convince herself that it must have been an emergency patient whom the doctor was treating. But why in the cellar? Why not in his treatment room on the ground floor? In the following weeks, Margaret observed her employer more closely, and the more she observed, the more disturbed she became by what she saw. There was, for example, the matter of purchases. Dr. Steinberg had large quantities of wine and bread delivered, supposedly for the poor patients he treated for free. But Margaret began to count. On treatment days, an average of 10 to 15 patients came, but the quantities of food and wine that were delivered would have been enough for 30 or 40 people. Where did the rest go? Then there were the strange smells. Sometimes, when Margaret opened the windows on the ground floor in the morning, a sweet, metallic smell wafted toward her that seemed to come from the cellar. A smell she knew without being able to name it. Only later, when the truth came to light, would she recognize. It was the smell of blood, of much blood. And finally, there were the things that disappeared. Personal items, a bag that a patient had left behind, a coat that hung on a hook, shoes that stood in front of the cellar door. Margaret tidied these things away, set them aside so the owners could pick them up, but no one ever came to pick them up. After a few days, the items simply disappeared without the doctor ever explaining where they had been taken. Margaret was not an educated woman, but she wasn't stupid either. The puzzle pieces slowly came together to form a picture she didn't like. But what should she do? To whom should she turn? Dr. Steinberg was a respected man, a physician to the town council. Who would believe her? A simple housekeeper. If she voiced suspicions against him, she decided to remain silent, a decision she would regret for the rest of her life. But fear was stronger than her conscience. The fear of losing her position, the fear of being suspected herself, and above all, the fear of what she had seen in the cellar. Margaret Brennan was not the only one who noticed things that weren't right. Father John Grimshaw, the confessor of St. Francis Church, had also begun to recognize a disturbing pattern. For years, people had come to him in the confessional, with worries and fears about missing relatives. Mostly, they were poor people, people who lived on the margins of society. A mother searched for her son, a young beggar. A sister missed her older sibling, a prostitute. An old man asked about his brother, who had disappeared weeks ago. Each individual case in itself was not unusual. In these times, people disappeared constantly. They died of disease, they left town, they became victims of robberies. But Father Grimshaw was a careful man who kept records. And in his records, he discovered a pattern. Almost all missing persons who were reported to him had one thing in common. They had been to Dr. Steinberg shortly before their disappearance. Some had sought free treatment there. Others had been invited to his home, supposedly to help them with food and medicine. Father Grimshaw knew Dr. Steinberg personally. They had met at various social occasions, had discussed medical and theological questions. The doctor had always presented himself as a pious man who put his abilities in the service of the needy. How could such a man be involved in something wrong? Nevertheless, the father decided to investigate cautiously. He began specifically looking for people who had been to Dr. Steinberg and later disappeared. The results of his investigations were disturbing. In the last 2 years, at least 30 people had disappeared who all had a connection to Dr. Steinberg. 30 people whom no one missed, except perhaps a desperate family member who came to the confessional to pray for the lost soul. Father Grimshaw faced a dilemma. On the one hand, his evidence was purely indirect. A correlation between visits to Dr. Steinberg and the disappearance of these people didn't necessarily mean that the doctor was responsible for their disappearance. On the other hand, the pattern was too conspicuous to ignore. In the spring of 1872, Father Grimshaw made a decision. He would go to the town council and present his concerns. But when he discussed his plan with the older Father Benedict, he was urgently warned. "Brother John," said the old father, "Dr. Steinberg is a powerful man. He is the physician to the council. He has friends in the highest circles. If you accuse him and are wrong, it will cost you your position. And if you're right," he paused meaningfully, "if you're right, and he is indeed involved in dark machinations, it could cost you your life." Father Grimshaw hesitated. He was a brave man, but he was also cautious. He decided to gather more evidence before making public accusations, a decision that would cost more people their lives. A third person also noticed the strange occurrences around Dr. Steinberg. Thomas Woodman, the night watchman. Woodman was a former soldier who had lost a leg in the war and now made his living as a night watchman. His route took him every night through Elm Street, past Dr. Steinberg's house. And in recent months, he had observed things that gave him pause. Several times, he had seen light in the windows of Dr. Steinberg's house late at night, even though the doctor was supposedly already in bed. Once he saw a figure that, under cover of darkness, was carrying something out of the house that looked like a large sack. Another time, he heard strange voices coming from the house, voices that sounded frightened, almost like cries for help. But what gave Woodman most pause was the matter of the wagon. About once a month, always at new moon, a wagon without a lantern pulled up in front of Dr. Steinberg's house. The wagon waited for a while. Then 2 men came out of the house, loading something wrapped in cloths onto the wagon. Then the wagon drove off in the direction of Blackwood Forest. Woodman had initially assumed it was medical deliveries or patients who had to be transported at night. But why did this always happen in secret? Why at new moon when the night was darkest? And why always toward Blackwood Forest, where there were only a few settlements? When Woodman tried to follow the wagon once, he lost it in the maze of dark alleys outside the town walls. When he discreetly inquired the next day, no one could remember seeing a wagon that night. It was as if the wagon and its cargo had vanished without a trace. Woodman considered whether he should report his observations to the town commander. But what had he really seen? A wagon, some figures, things wrapped in cloth. None of that was clearly criminal. And Dr. Steinberg was a respected man. Who would believe a crippled night watchman? So Thomas Woodman also remained silent and hoped that his fears were unfounded. But truth has a way of bringing itself to light. And in the autumn of 1872, a chain of coincidences would lead to Dr. Steinberg's carefully constructed facade finally collapsing. The loggers who had gone into Blackwood Forest in October to cut firewood for the coming winter hadn't intended to venture so deep into the woods, but the more easily accessible areas had already been logged, so they dared to venture into areas that were normally avoided. It was Jacob Miller, a strong man of 30, who made the discovery. He had gone somewhat off from the group in search of a good pine when he came upon a narrow ravine that was so densely overgrown with undergrowth that it was almost invisible. Something, perhaps curiosity, perhaps just chance, drove him to push the undergrowth aside and descend into the ravine. The ground was soft and damp, covered with a thick layer of decomposing leaves. And then he saw it. A hand protruding from the earth, pale and with fingers spread, as if reaching for help. Miller let out a scream that summoned his comrades. Together they began to dig carefully. What they found exceeded their worst fears. In the ravine, 13 bodies were buried. Some only a few weeks old, others obviously months or even years. Men, women, even children. All fully clothed, but with one gruesome common feature. Their skin was pale as limestone, their bodies completely dried out, as if all blood had been squeezed out of them. And all, without exception, had 2 precise puncture wounds on their necks, approximately where the carotid artery runs. The loggers were simple, superstitious men. They immediately knew what they had found: the victims of a vampire. Belief in vampires was widespread in America in the 17th century. People believed in the undead, who rose from their graves at night to drink the blood of the living. In times of epidemics and unexplained deaths, graves were repeatedly opened to search for vampires. Corpses that had not yet fully decomposed, whose hair and nails still seemed to grow, were considered vampires and killed with a stake through the heart. Jacob Miller and his comrades were convinced that a real vampire was causing havoc in Blackwood Forest. Full of horror and fear, they made their way back to Ashford to inform the authorities. The news of the discovery spread like wildfire through the town. A vampire in Blackwood Forest. The citizens of Ashford were horrified and fascinated at the same time. Some crossed themselves and muttered prayers. Others armed themselves with consecrated crosses and garlic. Still others, the more educated citizens, shook their heads at the superstition, but even they couldn't deny that something terrible must have happened. The town council, led by Mayor Lawrence Schnelling, decided to take the matter seriously. An official investigation was initiated, and a group of town officials, soldiers, and, ironically, Dr. Augustus Steinberg himself were commissioned to ride to the ravine and examine the bodies. What no one knew, Dr. Steinberg himself had dumped these bodies there. The ravine was his secret cemetery, where he disposed of the bodies of his victims when the old well shaft in his cellar became too full. He had never expected anyone to find the remote ravine. When Steinberg heard the news of the discovery, cold terror ran through him. For 20 years he had operated in secret. 20 years in which he had carefully erased every trace, minimized every risk, and now everything threatened to blow up. But Steinberg was not just a monster. He was also a clever man. He knew his best chance was to control the investigation from within. As a recognized physician, people would listen to his expertise, to his assessment of the causes of death. He just had to steer the investigation so that it concluded the victims had been killed by wild animals or bandits, not by him. The investigation team reached the ravine the next morning at dawn. The light of the rising sun fell obliquely through the treetops and bathed the scene in a ghostly greenish light. The bodies still lay as the loggers had found them, only partially excavated, their faces frozen in a final expression of horror. Dr. Steinberg forced himself to remain calm as he examined the bodies. He had to avoid any appearance of nervousness. He knelt beside the first body, a young woman whose face was still recognizable, although she had obviously been dead for months. "This woman," he announced in a firm voice, "clearly died from blood loss. See here." He pointed to the 2 puncture wounds on the neck. These could be bite wounds, possibly from a large animal, a bear perhaps, or a wolf. But John Haberley, the town clerk and a man of sharp mind, shook his head. "With all due respect, doctor, but I've seen many animal bites. Wolves and bears tear their victims. They leave large, tattered wounds, not precise punctures. This here," he pointed to the small, almost surgical-looking holes, "doesn't look like an animal attack." Steinberg felt his palms fill with sweat. "Well," he said, trying to keep his voice even, "it could also have been a crime. Bandits who killed their victims in a cruel manner." 13 people? Asked Captain Dietrich von Hohenstein, the commander of the town watch. "All killed in the same way? All completely drained of blood? That seems to me more than ordinary banditry." The discussion might have continued for a long time had something not happened that steered the entire investigation in a new direction. One of the soldiers, a young man named Peter Kohler, had begun to search the pockets and clothing of the victims, hoping to find something that would reveal their identity. In the pocket of a male victim, he found a small, folded piece of paper. The note was damp and partially illegible, but parts of a message could still be deciphered. "Treatment with Dr. Steinberg, Elm Street. Promised healing." Dr. Steinberg felt the blood drain from his face, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Many poor people seek me out," he said quickly. "This man could have come to me and then, well, then something must have happened to him." But Town Clerk Haberley had already become alert. "Let's search the other bodies," he ordered. "Perhaps we'll find more clues." And they did. In the pockets and clothing of several victims, they found more traces leading to Dr. Steinberg, a prescription issued by him, a small vial with medicine on which his name was written, and in the hand of a young woman, clenched into a fist, as if she had held it in the death struggle, a piece of fabric, a fragment of a doctor's coat, like Dr. Steinberg wore. The evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. Captain von Hohenstein slowly turned to Dr. Steinberg, his hand on the sword hilt. "Doctor," he said in an icy voice, "I believe you have some questions to answer." Dr. Steinberg knew that his carefully constructed world was collapsing at that moment. He could feel the gazes of the others, first incredulous, then suspicious, finally accusing. 20 years of deception, 20 years of double life, ended here, in this God-forsaken ravine in Blackwood Forest. For a brief moment he considered fleeing. He was a good rider, and his horse stood only a few meters away. But where should he go? The soldiers would hunt him. And even if he escaped, where could a man like him go underground? His face was too well known, his name too famous. No, flight was not an option. But perhaps, he thought with the cunning of a man who had gone undetected for 20 years, there was another possibility. If he couldn't deny, he had to control the narrative. He had to turn the story so that he didn't appear as a monster, but as what? As a victim? As a madman? As a scientist who had gone too far? Yes, he finally said, with a voice that sounded firm even though his insides were trembling. I will answer your questions. But not here. Not at this place of death. Take me back to Ashford. There I will tell you everything. The whole truth. Captain von Hohenstein nodded curtly. Dr. Steinberg, I arrest you in the name of the Ashford Town Council. You are accused of involvement in the deaths of these people. Disarm him and put him in chains. As the iron chains were closed around his wrists, Dr. Steinberg felt something like relief for the first time in many years. The burden of years of deception, of constant hiding, of eternal fear of discovery, all of it fell away from him. Whatever would come now, at least he no longer had to pretend to be someone he wasn't. The journey back to Ashford took 2 hours. The group rode in oppressive silence. No one dared to speak. The realization that a respected citizen, a doctor, a man whom everyone had respected, was possibly a mass murderer, paralyzed even the most talkative spirits. When the group reached the town gates, the news had already spread. A crowd had gathered, curious and agitated at the same time. Is it true? Some called out. Is the doctor the vampire? Captain von Hohenstein ordered his men to push the crowd back. Dr. Steinberg was taken directly to the town hall, where an emergency meeting of the council had already been convened. What happened in the following hours would forever change the town of Ashford, because Dr. Augustus Steinberg decided to make a comprehensive confession, not out of remorse, but out of an almost perverse pride in his work. He wanted the world to understand what he had tried to achieve, what great goal he had pursued. If this story already captivates you, then subscribe to our channel now, because what you've heard so far is only the beginning. The truth about Dr. Steinberg's deeds is even more terrifying than you can imagine, and I promise you, this story will haunt you for a long time. Chapter 3. The Confession. The interrogation room in Ashford's town hall was small and windowless. Only the flickering light of candles illuminated the room where Dr. Augustus Steinberg sat chained to a heavy oak table. Opposite him sat Mayor Schnelling, Town Clerk Haberle, Captain von Hohenstein, and Father Grimshaw, who had been called in as moral authority. The atmosphere was tense. No one really knew how to deal with this situation. Accusing a respected doctor of murder was unprecedented. And the nature of the alleged crimes, the complete draining of blood from the victims, the vampire-like puncture wounds, gave the whole thing a supernatural, nightmarish quality. Mayor Schnelling cleared his throat. Dr. Steinberg, he began in a trembling voice, you said you would tell the truth. We are listening. Dr. Steinberg raised his head. His eyes, which had once seemed so trustworthy and friendly, now seemed to have a different quality. Cold, distant, almost reptilian. When he began to speak, his voice was calm and matter-of-fact, as if he were reporting on a medical experiment and not mass murder. What I will tell you, he said, will challenge your understanding of life and death, of science and the limits of the possible. I am not a vampire, as the common people believe. I am not one of the undead who rises from the grave to suck blood. I am a scientist, a researcher, a man who has faced the greatest challenge of humanity, overcoming death itself. Father Grimshaw wanted to protest, overcoming death is blasphemy. But Mayor Schnelling raised his hand. Let him speak. We need to understand what happened here. Steinberg nodded gratefully and continued. I have dedicated my life to the study of alchemy, the search for the philosopher's stone, for the elixir of eternal life. The old masters, Paracelsus, Agrippa von Nettesheim, Nicholas Flamel, they were all convinced that the key to immortality exists. And after years of study, I came to a realization. The secret lies in blood. He leaned back as far as his chains allowed. Blood is life. The Holy Scripture itself says so. But it's more than a metaphor. Blood carries the life force within it. It nourishes every part of the body. It is warm when we live and cold when we die. If one could decipher the secret of blood, if one could extract and concentrate the essence of life from the blood of many people, then one could create an elixir that prevents aging, cures diseases, and perhaps even grants immortality. The men in the room stared at him, unable to comprehend what they were hearing. "How many?" asked Town Clerk Haberley in a choked voice. "How many people did you kill for this madness?" Steinberg's gaze became glassy, as if he were looking back into the past. "I didn't count. Not at first. But later, when I became more systematic, I began keeping records. I estimate between 150 and 200 people, over a period of 20 years. A collective gasp went through the room. 200 people. The sheer number exceeded all imagination. "How?" asked Captain von Hohenstein, with a voice trembling with rage. "How could you remain undetected for so long?" A faint smile flitted across Steinberg's face, a smile that made those present shudder. "By exploiting the weaknesses of human nature, greed, indifference, prejudice. The people I killed were outcasts, beggars, prostitutes, vagabonds, people whom no one missed, people whom society had already written off as worthless. They were children of God!" Father Grimshaw cried indignantly. "Perhaps," Steinberg replied coolly, "but society didn't treat them as such. You see, that was my insight. I only had to choose people whose disappearance interested no one. And I had to use my position as a respected doctor and benefactor to be above all suspicion." He then told them in horrifying detail how his system had worked, how he lured poor people to his house with promises of free treatment or food, how he gave them wine laced with opium, how he took them to his cellars when they were unconscious, and how he tied them to his tables there and systematically drained their blood. The process took several hours, he explained matter-of-factly, as if describing a medical procedure. I used special needles I had developed myself. They were inserted into the carotid artery, and the blood flowed into glass vessels that I carefully labeled and categorized. Most victims remained unconscious until they died. Some woke up. That was unfortunate, but necessary for my research. Mayor Schnelling had turned deathly pale. "You speak of murder as if it were a craft." "For me, it was science," Steinberg replied. "Each victim brought me closer to my goal. I experimented with different methods of blood treatment: distillation, crystallization, mixing with rare herbs and minerals. I kept records of every single attempt, every variant, every result." "And," asked Town Clerk Haberley in a bitter voice, "did you find it, your elixir of eternal life?" For the first time since the interrogation began, genuine emotion could be seen in Steinberg's face. Frustration, disappointment, perhaps even despair. "No," he admitted quietly. "I came close to the secret, I'm sure of that. Some of my preparations showed promising properties. They slowed the decay of organic material. They seemed to influence cellular processes. But the ultimate goal that remained denied to me. Perhaps I needed more time, more attempts, more." He fell silent as he realized what he was about to say. More victims. The interrogation lasted all night. Steinberg told everything, from his first tentative murders, through the perfection of his system, to the elaborate experiments in his underground laboratory. He showed no remorse, no shame. For him, the murders had been means to an end, necessary steps on the path to a higher goal. Perhaps most frightening was his description of the victims. He remembered some with disturbing clarity, their names, their stories, their last words. He spoke of them with a strange mixture of indifference and scientific interest, as if they had been laboratory animals and not people. "There was, for example, Anna Keeler," he recounted, "a young prostitute, about 20 years old. She came to me with a venereal disease. I actually treated her at first. Her symptoms improved, but then I realized she was perfect for my purposes. Young, healthy, with fresh, strong blood. No one would miss a prostitute. I invited her to stay in my house while she recovered. She was so grateful. His voice trailed off in memory. Or little Frank, an orphan boy, maybe 8 years old. He had lived on the streets, fed on scraps. I gave him food, gave him warm clothes. He called me Uncle Doctor. When I finally took him to the cellar, he didn't understand what was happening. He thought until the end that I was helping him. Steinberg's voice remained monotonous, emotionless. Father Grimshaw could no longer contain himself. You are a monster, a demon in human form. Steinberg looked at him calmly. Call it what you will, Father. I am a man who was willing to cross moral boundaries in service of a higher truth. History may condemn me, or it will recognize me as a pioneer who was willing to make sacrifices, even if they were the sacrifices of others, to show humanity the path to immortality. As morning dawned, the interrogation was over. Dr. Augustus Steinberg had made a comprehensive confession that exceeded in its scope and brutality anything the town of Ashford had ever experienced. The question now was, what should be done with this knowledge? Mayor Schnelling convened the entire town council for an emergency meeting. The news of Steinberg's confession had already spread through the town, and an agitated crowd had gathered in front of the town hall. Some demanded immediate execution. Others wanted Steinberg burned as a witch. Still others, the more educated, insisted on a proper trial. Captain von Hohenstein suggested searching the house on Elm Street. If his confession is true, he said, then we must find evidence in his cellar, his laboratory, the tools, perhaps even more victims. A search party was formed. 20 soldiers, led by Captain von Hohenstein himself, plus town clerk Haberly and Father Grimshaw as witnesses. What they found in Dr. Steinberg's house would exceed even the most vivid imagination. The housekeeper Margaret opened the door, pale and trembling. She had of course heard of her employer's arrest and had not slept all night, tormented by guilt and fear. I didn't know anything, she stammered. But her eyes betrayed that she had known more than she was willing to admit. Captain von Hohenstein and his men would not be stopped. They stormed directly to the heavy oak door leading to the cellar. The door was locked, but a strong soldier hacked out the lock with his axe. What the men found when they descended the stone steps exceeded their worst fears. The first room, which had served as a waiting area, was furnished with benches and tables. On the tables still stood goblets with wine residue, wine that had been laced with opium to render the victims defenseless. The second room was the actual laboratory. On the walls hung tools that made men who normally shrank from nothing feel their blood freeze in their veins. Long needles of polished steel, scalpels of various sizes, tubes of leather and rubber. And on the tables, dried and dark, the unmistakable traces of blood. In the corner stood a shelf full of leather books, Steinberg's records. Town clerk Haberly took one of the books and began to read. His hands trembled as he went through the methodically kept lists. The 23rd of June, 1854. Subject number 12. Female, approx. 25 years. Blood volume, 4.2 liters. Quality, good. Use, distillation experiment, no. 7. The 8th of November, 1859. Subject, no 47. Male, approx. 40 years. Blood volume, 4.8 liters. Quality, excellent. Use, crystallization. Experiment with silver and mercury. Page after page, book after book. A meticulous documentation of horror spanning 20 years. Haberly closed the book and vomited in a corner. The third room, where Steinberg had stored the collected blood, offered an even more horrifying sight. Shelves with hundreds of glass vessels, some still filled with dark red, dried liquid. In the center of the room stood the distillation apparatus, a complex structure of glass and copper that looked like a perverse parody of a church organ. And then the fourth room, the disposal room. When the soldiers opened the last door, they were hit by a smell that made even hardened war veterans gag. The stench of decay, of death, of unimaginable suffering. In the center of the room gaped a black hole, the old well shaft that Steinberg had used as a mass grave. Captain von Hohenstein ordered ropes and lanterns to be brought. Several soldiers were lowered into the shaft. What they found would populate their nightmares for the rest of their lives. The shaft was about 20 meters deep, and at the bottom, dozens of corpses were piled in various stages of decomposition. Men, women, children, all completely drained of blood, all with the same precise puncture wounds on their necks. One of the soldiers, a young man named Sebastian Weber, broke into tears and had to be brought up. "They're staring at me," he sobbed. "All those dead eyes. They're staring at me and accusing me that we didn't come sooner." The recovery of the bodies took 3 days. A total of 172 bodies were recovered from the well shaft, together with the 13 from the ravine in Blackwood Forest. That made 185 identified victims. But Dr. Steinberg's records spoke of more than 200 murders, which meant that more bodies must still be hidden somewhere. The town of Ashford was in shock. How was it possible that such a monster had lived among them for 20 years? How could they all have been so blind? Guilt and shame spread like a contagious disease. Margaret Brennan, the housekeeper, tried to take her own life, but was rescued at the last moment. Father Grimshaw retreated to his church for a week to fast and pray, tormented by the realization that he should have voiced his concerns earlier. Thomas Woodman, the night watchman, gave up his position, unable to walk the streets at night that Steinberg's victims had traversed. The citizens of Ashford asked themselves questions, for which there were no simple answers. Should we have seen it? Should we have been able to interpret the signs? How many of us looked away when it was uncomfortable to look? Dr. William Hartman, a young doctor who had come to Ashford only 2 years ago, put it this way in a letter to a colleague: "We all bear part of the guilt, not for the murders themselves. That burden lies on Steinberg's shoulders alone, but for our indifference toward the weakest in our society. Steinberg could murder for so long because his victims were people we had already written off as worthless. We didn't search for the missing beggars because beggars were indifferent to us. We didn't miss the missing prostitutes because we despised prostitutes. In a way, we delivered the victims to Steinberg by creating a society where some people count and others don't." This bitter truth would occupy the town for a long time to come. Write in the comments. Would you have recognized the signs? Or would you too have been deceived by Dr. Steinberg's respectable facade? And if you like this story, and I know like is the wrong word for something so gruesome, then leave a like and share this video. The story is not yet over. Chapter IV: The Trial and the Execution. The trial against Dr. Augustus Steinberg began on the 15th of November, 1872, and became one of the most spectacular court proceedings in American history. People from all over New England traveled to Ashford to follow the trial. Interest was so great that the town council decided to hold the proceedings in the Episcopal Church itself, the only building in Ashford large enough to accommodate the crowds. 3 judges presided: Chief Justice Matthias von Ehrlich from Boston, State Judge John Frederick from Springfield, and as local representative, Mayor Lawrence Schnelling. The prosecution was presented by Town Clerk Haberly, while Dr. Steinberg was defended by a lawyer from Providence, a certain Dr. Herman Metz, who had taken the case only reluctantly. The sight of Dr. Steinberg as he was led into the courtroom shocked many of those present. The once so distinguished, well-dressed doctor had become a hollow-eyed, unkempt figure. He had lost weight drastically in the weeks of his imprisonment, and his once so carefully groomed hair hung in greasy strands. But his eyes, those dark, penetrating eyes, had lost none of their intensity. The indictment was overwhelming. Town Clerk Haberley presented evidence in an abundance and detail that made even the most hardened spectators shudder. Steinberg's own records were read aloud, page after page of sober descriptions of the most gruesome murders. The tools from his laboratory were shown. Witnesses appeared: Margaret the housekeeper, Thomas Woodman the night watchman, Father Grimshaw, all reporting on their observations and suspicions. The most shattering testimony came from the relatives of the victims who had traveled to Ashford. Maria Hoffman, whose younger brother was among the dead, described through tears how the family had searched for him for months. "We thought he might have found work," she said in a choked voice, "or that he had moved on. We thought of everything, except that a doctor, a man we would have trusted, could have slaughtered him like an animal." Dr. Steinberg listened to all this with an unmoved face. He denied nothing. On the contrary, when given the opportunity to defend himself, he essentially repeated what he had already said in his first interrogation: that he had been a scientist, seeking higher knowledge, that his victims had been necessary for the progress of humanity. "I regret nothing," he declared before the packed church. "Every great advance in science requires sacrifices. Anatomy developed only because doctors were willing to dissect corpses, a practice long condemned by the church as sin. Medicine makes progress through experiments that sometimes go wrong and cost people their lives. I went further, yes. I deliberately killed people to study their life essence, but I did it for a higher goal: overcoming death itself, the greatest gift one could give humanity." These words unleashed a storm of indignation. People in the pews screamed curses. Father Grimshaw stood up and called out, "This is blasphemy! Overcoming death is in God's hands alone." Chief Justice von Ehrlich had to strike his hammer on the bench several times to restore order. When tempers calmed, he turned directly to the defendant. "Dr. Steinberg," he said in an icy voice, "you invoke science. But science without morality is not enlightenment. It is barbarism. You speak of giving humanity a gift, but you have deprived 200 people of their most basic rights: the right to life, to dignity, to a natural death. You are not a pioneer. You are a murderer." The defense attorney, Dr. Metz, attempted one last desperate objection. He pleaded insanity. "My client," he argued, "is obviously insane. No person in their right mind would act as he has acted. He should not be executed but committed to an asylum for the criminally insane." But the judges were unmoved. After 3 days of testimony, deliberations lasted only 4 hours. The verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts of murder in the first degree. The sentence: death by hanging. When the verdict was read, Dr. Steinberg showed no reaction. He simply nodded, as if he had expected nothing else. But as he was led out of the courtroom, he turned once more to the assembled crowd. "You condemn me today," he said in a loud, clear voice. "But mark my words, a day will come when humanity will understand what I tried to achieve. A day when my research will be recognized as pioneering. And on that day, you will erect monuments to me, not gallows." These words sent a chill through all present. Was this man truly mad? Or was he perhaps right, in some twisted way? The execution was scheduled for the 1st of December, 1872, at dawn. According to custom, the condemned man was allowed to have a last meal and receive spiritual counsel. Father Grimshaw visited Steinberg in his cell the night before the execution. "Do you wish to confess?" the father asked. "To make your peace with God before you meet him?" Steinberg laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Peace with God? Father, if there is a God, he and I will have much to discuss when I meet him. I will ask him why he created a world where death is inevitable. Why he gave us minds capable of dreaming of immortality, but bodies that must rot and die. And I will ask him why. If seeking to overcome death is such a terrible sin, he gave us the desire to live forever. Father Grimshaw left the cell deeply shaken. He had ministered to many condemned men in his life, but never had he met one so utterly unrepentant, so convinced of the righteousness of his cause. The morning of December 1 dawned cold and gray. A heavy fog hung over Ashford, as if nature itself mourned the dark events about to unfold. The gallows had been erected on town square, and despite the early hour and the cold, thousands of people had gathered to witness the execution. Dr. Steinberg was led to the gallows in chains, flanked by armed guards. He walked calmly, his head held high, showing no sign of fear. When he reached the platform, he was asked if he had any last words. He looked out over the assembled crowd, his dark eyes seeming to see each individual person. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the square. "Citizens of Ashford," he began, "you have judged me and found me guilty. You see me as a monster, a demon who preyed upon the innocent. And perhaps, by your standards, I am. But I ask you to remember this. I sought to give humanity the ultimate gift, freedom from death itself. The methods I used were harsh, yes, but would you not sacrifice a few to save many? Would you not trade the lives of 100 beggars and prostitutes, people already living in misery, for the secret of eternal life that could save countless millions in the future?" A murmur went through the crowd. Some shouted in anger, others in confusion. "You call me evil," Steinberg continued. "But what is evil? Is it not evil that children die of disease? That mothers are taken from their families by consumption? That old age steals our minds and bodies? I sought to end this evil, to free humanity from the tyranny of death. And for this you hang me." He paused, then spoke his final words. "Go ahead, kill me, but know this. Others will follow in my footsteps. Others who dare to dream of immortality, who dare to challenge God's monopoly on life and death. And perhaps one day, they will succeed where I failed. And on that day, you will remember me not as a monster, but as a martyr to science." With those words, the executioner placed the hood over Steinberg's head and the noose around his neck. Father Grimshaw said a final prayer, though he doubted Steinberg heard or cared. At exactly 7 o'clock, the trapdoor opened, and Dr. Augustus Steinberg fell to his death. Or so everyone believed. But here is where the story takes its most chilling turn. For what happened next would give rise to legends that persist to this day. Dr. Steinberg's body was left hanging for the customary hour to ensure death was complete. Then it was cut down and examined by the town physician, Dr. Hartmann. The examination confirmed what everyone expected. Steinberg was dead, his neck broken cleanly by the fall. According to the wishes of the town council, the body was not to be given a proper burial. Instead, it was to be taken to an unmarked grave in unconsecrated ground, far from town. A wagon was prepared, and 4 soldiers were assigned to transport the body. But the wagon never reached its destination. The 4 soldiers, all reliable men, veterans of the Civil War, later told a story that most dismissed as hysteria or drunkenness. But they all told the same story, independently, and they swore on the Bible it was true. They had loaded Steinberg's body onto the wagon and driven toward the forest. About 2 miles out of town, as they were passing through a particularly dark stretch of road where the trees grew thick on both sides, the horses suddenly became agitated. They whinnied and reared, refusing to go forward. Sergeant James Mitchell, who was driving the wagon, tried to calm them, but to no avail. Then, he said, he heard a sound from the back of the wagon, a sound like cloth rustling. When he turned to look, his blood ran cold. The shroud covering Steinberg's body was moving. At first he thought it was just the wind, but there was no wind that night. The air was still and heavy. And then, as he watched in frozen horror, a hand emerged from the shroud. A pale hand with long fingers, reaching upward as if grasping for something. The other 3 soldiers saw it too. They all swore they saw it. And then they said they heard a voice, low and rasping but unmistakably human, coming from beneath the shroud. "Not yet," the voice said. "Not yet." That was enough. The 4 soldiers, brave men who had faced Confederate bullets without flinching, panicked. They leaped from the wagon and ran back toward town, leaving the horses and the wagon and Steinberg's body behind. When a larger armed party returned to the spot at first light, they found the wagon. The horses were there, still agitated but unharmed. But Steinberg's body was gone. The shroud lay empty in the back of the wagon, and there was no sign of the corpse anywhere. A massive search was conducted. Soldiers and volunteers combed every inch of the forest for miles around. But no trace of Steinberg's body was ever found. It had simply vanished. The official explanation was that wolves or other animals had dragged the body away, but many refused to believe this. Wolves might drag a body a short distance, but they would leave traces: blood, torn clothing, bones. There was nothing. The body had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. And then the sightings began. Over the following months, people reported seeing a tall, gaunt figure in the forests around Ashford, always at night, always in the shadows. Some said it was just a hermit or a madman, but others, those who got close enough to see clearly, swore they recognized the figure. It was Dr. Steinberg. A farmer named Samuel Brown claimed he saw the figure near his barn one night. "It was him," Brown insisted. "I'd swear it on my life. Same height, same build. And when he turned to look at me, I saw his eyes. Those same dark, terrible eyes that looked at us in the courtroom. He smiled at me, and then he just faded into the shadows, like he was never there." A young woman named Elizabeth Carter reported an even more disturbing encounter. She was walking home from a friend's house late one evening when she saw a man standing by the side of the road. He was dressed in dark clothes and stood perfectly still, just watching her. As she hurried past, trying not to look at him, he spoke. "You need not fear me, child," the voice said. "I have no interest in the healthy and strong. But tell me, do you know anyone who is sick? Anyone close to death? I can help them. I have learned so much." Elizabeth ran without looking back. When she told her father, he organized a search party, but they found no one. The sightings continued for years, always in the forest, always at night. And always, the figure was described the same way: tall, gaunt, with dark, penetrating eyes, and a voice that spoke of medical knowledge and offers of help. But the most disturbing reports came from the poor and the desperate, the same kinds of people Steinberg had preyed upon in life. Several reported being approached by a kindly doctor who offered them free treatment, who invited them to his house in the woods. Those who accepted the invitation never returned. Those who refused would later swear they had seen Dr. Steinberg. Over the decades, dozens of people disappeared in the woods around Ashford, far more than could be explained by natural causes or normal accidents. The pattern was too consistent, too similar to Steinberg's original crimes. People began to whisper that he was still out there, still conducting his experiments, still searching for the elixir of immortality. To this day, there are those who believe Dr. Augustus Steinberg never truly died, that somehow, through his experiments with blood and life essence, he discovered a way to cheat death. That he is still out there in Blackwood Forest, still hunting, still searching for the secret that eluded him in life. The house on Elm Street, where Steinberg committed his atrocities, was burned to the ground in 1873, at the insistence of the townspeople. But even now, over 150 years later, no one has built on that lot. It remains an empty, overgrown patch of ground that locals avoid, especially after dark. And in the deep woods of Blackwood Forest, where the trees grow thick and the sunlight never quite penetrates, hikers and hunters still sometimes report strange things. Abandoned campsites, where the fire still burns, but no one is around. Makeshift laboratories hidden in caves, filled with old glass bottles and strange apparatus. And occasionally, very occasionally, someone will glimpse a figure moving through the trees, tall and gaunt, with dark, piercing eyes that seem to look right through you. The official record states that Dr. Augustus Steinberg died on the 1st of December, 1872, executed for the murders of 185 people. But the unofficial record, the stories whispered late at night, the legends passed down through generations, tells a different tale. A tale of a man who sought immortality, and perhaps, in the most terrible way possible, found it. The legacy of Dr. Steinberg. The story of Dr. Augustus Steinberg, the Vampire of Ashford, has had a lasting impact on American culture and criminology. It was one of the first documented cases of a serial killer operating under the guise of respectability, a pattern that would tragically repeat itself many times in the centuries to come. In the years following Steinberg's execution, or disappearance, depending on who you believe, significant changes were made to how doctors were monitored and regulated. The American Medical Association, still relatively new at the time, implemented stricter oversight procedures. Medical schools began teaching ethics as a core part of their curriculum, and towns across America began to keep better records of their citizens, making it harder for people to simply vanish without notice. The case also had a profound impact on how society viewed its most vulnerable members. The fact that Steinberg could murder so many people simply because they were poor, homeless, or otherwise marginalized forced uncomfortable questions about social responsibility. Some historians argue that the Steinberg case was one of the catalysts for the progressive era reforms of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which sought to improve conditions for the poor and establish social safety nets. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Dr. Steinberg is in the realm of legend and folklore. His story has inspired countless works of fiction, from dime novels in the 1,880 seconds to modern horror films. Elements of his story can be seen in everything from Bram Stoker's Dracula, published in 1897, just 25 years after Steinberg's crimes came to light, to modern thrillers about medical serial killers. And in Ashford itself, the memory lingers. The town, now a small city, has tried to move past its dark history, but it hasn't been forgotten. The Ashford Historical Society maintains an exhibit about the case, though many residents wish they wouldn't. Tour companies offer dark history walking tours that visit the sites connected to Steinberg's crimes. And every Halloween, despite the objections of town leaders, people come from all over to visit Blackwood Forest, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary Vampire of Ashford. The spot where Steinberg's house once stood remains empty. Several attempts have been made over the years to build there, but each has ended in failure, either through mysterious accidents, financial problems, or simply an inability to find workers willing to work on the site. The land has effectively become a memorial, though not one anyone wanted. As for the question of whether Steinberg truly died or somehow survived, that remains one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. The official records say he died, but the persistence of the sightings, spanning decades and continuing to this day, gives even skeptics pause. In 2015, a team of paranormal investigators received permission to conduct a search of Blackwood Forest using modern technology, including thermal imaging and motion sensors. On the third night of their investigation, their equipment recorded something that has never been explained. Thermal cameras picked up a heat signature moving through the forest, human-sized and human-shaped, but with a body temperature significantly lower than normal. When investigators rushed to the location, they found nothing but disturbed ground and what appeared to be old medical instruments partially buried in the soil. The footage was analyzed by experts who confirmed it hadn't been faked or manipulated. The investigators themselves were badly shaken by the experience and refused to return to the forest. The footage can still be found online and has been viewed millions of times, though skeptics dismiss it as an elaborate hoax. Whatever the truth, the story of Dr. Augustus Steinberg serves as a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always come in the form of obvious monsters. Sometimes it wears a respectable face, a caring smile, and offers to help. Sometimes the greatest horrors are perpetrated not by supernatural creatures, but by human beings who have convinced themselves that their terrible actions serve a higher purpose. And sometimes, just sometimes, the line between life and death, between human and monster, between myth and reality, is thinner than we'd like to believe. The vampire of Ashford may be dead, or he may be out there still, in the deep woods where the sunlight never reaches, still searching, still hunting, still pursuing the immortality that cost so many their lives. The truth, like so much else about this case, remains shrouded in darkness.